The 70s had some of the greatest, most iconic, and most important horror movies of all time. Halloween, The Exorcist, Jaws, Dawn of the Dead, Eraserhead, Suspiria, and so many more. It also had some pretty out there stuff, and I know some of the ones I just mentioned can be considered pretty out there, but there was some really out there stuff. Like Deathbed, the bed that eats, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's about a bed that eats, mostly people, but also regular food like this bucket of fried chicken. But this film was also basically lost for a long time, and rumors of this strange movie about a bed that eats people kind of floated around for years before it eventually was rediscovered. So where did it come from? Where did it go, and how was it found? Well, luckily for you, I've got the answers to all of those questions. Deathbed, the Bed That Eats was first conceptualized by George Barry, some guy from Detroit. There really isn't a whole lot of info online about Barry, although I did find out that he sadly passed away just a couple years ago. In the early 70s, though, he had just finished college and he was interested in working in the film industry. And one day he had a nightmare about a bed that was consuming people, and he couldn't even really remember if he was like an observer of the bed or if he was one of the victims. All he remembered was that this bed was eating people. And for whatever reason, he thought to himself, man, I should make that into a movie. And that's exactly what he did. So Barry, who seemingly had almost no prior experience in film, decided to write, produce, and direct this film all by himself. He was inspired by both exploitation cinema by filmmakers like Roger Corman, but also by European art house films, which coincidentally Barry said were playing in drive-ins at the time, which probably refers to the European films Roger Corman was distributing then, like Ingmar Bergman's Cries and Whispers, which again, for some reason he distributed to drive-ins. I can't really see a whole lot of kids in the 70s wanting to go see Cries and Whispers at the drive-in and, sit there and make out during that, but I mean, hey, I guess it worked. And I think this mix of art house and grindhouse influence really comes through in Deathbed because it kind of feels like this bizarre mix of both classifications. It feels a little too artsy and psychedelic for typical exploitation trash, but also kind of too strange and campy for an art house movie. Production began in 1972. Dave Marsh, a writer and editor for Cream magazine, was cast as the artist, basically the narrator of the film, based on real artist Aubrey Beardsley, who was trapped in this painting by the evil bed and is now forced to watch as the bed eats people. As far as I know, this didn't happen in real life and Beardsley just died from tuberculosis. But this whole artist narrator thing just kind of adds another really weird aspect to the film. You just would not see this in any other exploitation films of the time. It's just bizarre. Demi Hall was cast as a lead actress in the film and ended up having a very successful career in theater in Seattle, and William Russ, who later became one of those guys who was in every TV show ever, was given his first role as one of the leads here as well. The rest of the cast and crew was mostly brought in from Canada to avoid having to pay union fees, as the film was shot on a very low budget of $30,000 that Barry had somehow scrounged up. Again, I don't really know how because he was just out of college at this point. Apparently $10,000 of it was his own money and $20,000 he got from other people. It was apparently shot pretty quickly in 1972, with principal photography taking only a couple weeks. But post-production did not go so well. It took Barry over 4 years to edit the film, and he finally completed it in 1977. And honestly, I could sit here and explain the film to you, but I kind of already have. It's a bed that eats people, but it's also just so strange and fascinating that I'd really recommend you check it out yourself. Explaining it just doesn't do it justice. I honestly like the effect of people getting eaten and submerged in the bed's stomach acid. I think it's fun, and also at one point a cross falls into the stomach acid and kind of looks like Piss Christ, that photo, 10 years before that photo was taken, so I just thought that was kind of interesting. There's also a part where a guy puts his hands into the bed, and when he takes them out, they're just these perfectly clean, white skeleton hands. It's incredible. Although I think my personal favorite part might be when the bed eats some gangsters and they're just randomly firing this obviously unloaded gun at it. It's just great stuff. You just gotta see it yourself. But you may still be thinking now, well, the movie's finished, so how was it lost and how was it found again? Well, the post-production issues don't end with the lengthy editing process. By the time the film was finished in 1977, the general cinema landscape was just changing. Big blockbusters like Star Wars were starting to come out, and it was getting tougher for these little independent exploitation and art house films to get distributed, unless they were ripping off the massively successful Halloween. So Barry could just never find a distributor. Years went by and Deathbed just never got a release. That was until VHS. Of course, in the early 80s, the home video market exploded in popularity, giving a great new opportunity for independent filmmakers to get their movies on the market. So at some point in the early 80s, about 5 or 6 years after Deathbed's completion, some unidentified home video company from Los Angeles found out about this bizarre film about the bed that eats. They contacted Barry seeking to distribute it on VHS, but only in the UK for some reason. So Barry sent them a rough print of the film, which is apparently missing the credits among a few other things. The company offered to pay Barry $1,000, but they needed a complete copy of the film with the credits included. So including the credits and sending it back to them would have cost about $3,000, which Barry obviously just did not want to pay, so he just kind of gave up and eventually ended up opening a rare bookstore, which was apparently really successful, and he continued running it until shortly before he passed away. So the unidentified film distributor sent the working copy back to Barry, and Deathbed was forgotten once again. But not totally this time, because this distributor actually did secretly make a VHS copy of the rough cut of the film, and that copy did end up in the UK. If I had to guess what happened here, I would assume Barry actually gave the physical film to the company and they made the VHS copy to send to their UK counterparts, just to show them the film without actually sending the reels over there, because it's a lot easier to send one tape than multiple big reels of 16mm film. Then the Los Angeles arm of the company probably told the UK guys, "We're not selling it, just get rid of it." So the UK company probably just sold it to a video store. Because this single tape ended up with Portland Films, a small, obscure distributor of 8mm films and movies on VHS. Portland Films seems to have operated a video store in London, which is where I assume they made a few bootleg copies of this film to sell. So bootleg copies of the movie began to float around the UK, with rumors of this bizarre film about a bed that eats people floating around with them. And just to add to the mystery of the film at this point, keep in mind there were no credits. Nobody knew who was involved with this thing, except for the copyright notice in the beginning. Credited to George Barry, which is not an easy name to track down now, so back then it had to have been near impossible to track this guy down, especially when you're on a different continent. The VHS copies began spreading across Europe during the 80s and 90s, eventually even being dubbed into Spanish at some point, but Barry was completely unaware of all of this. It does seem like a few copies may have made it to America, but it never spread around here the way it did in Europe. The movie basically became an urban legend, and it wasn't until 2001 when Barry was browsing the internet that he discovered a review of his own movie that he thought nobody else had ever seen. He then discovered this mysterious cult-like status the film had in Europe and did whatever he could to get the film properly distributed at that point, getting it screened publicly for the first time in 2003 at the San Francisco Independent Film Festival, then getting it a DVD release by Cult Epics shortly after. The film then grew a cult audience here in the United States too, quickly cementing itself as a classic of bizarro 70s outsider cinema. But again, I don't really think you get the full Deathbed experience until you actually watch it yourself and really admire this oddity. So go check it out.